consist of nothing but labor power spent in the course of commodity production, set flowing as labor. They do not consist of income or revenue, but rather of expenditure of labor. After this quid pro quo, in which revenue is made into the source of commodity value, instead of this commodity value being the source of revenue, commodity value now appears to be, comp q said, of the various kinds of revenues. These are determined independently of one another, and the total value of the commodity is determined by adding together the values of these revenues. But now this question arises: how can we determine the value of each of these revenues from which the commodity value is supposed to derive? In the case of wages, this can in fact be done, because wages are the value of the commodity labor power, and the latter can be determined, like the value of any other commodity, by the labor needed for its reproduction. But as for surplus value, or in Adam Smith's case its two forms, profit and rent, how are these to be determined? Here we are left with empty prattle. At some points Adam Smith depicts wages and surplus value, or wages and profit, as components out of which the commodity value or price is put together, while at others, and often almost in the same breath, he depicts them as parts into which the commodity value resolves itself. The latter, however, means that the commodity value is given first and that various parts of this given value accrue to different persons involved in the production process in the form of different revenues. This is in no way identical with the composition of value from these three components. If I define the lengths of three straight lines independently, and then make these three lines components of a fourth straight line equal in length to their sum, this is in no way the same procedure as if I start with a given straight line and divide this for some purpose or other. Resolve it, so to speak, into three parts. The length of the line in the first case invariably changes with the length of the three lines whose sum it forms. In the latter case the length of the three segments is limited from the beginning by their forming parts of a line of a given size. 460. The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital. In point of fact, if we stick to what is correct in Smith's presentation, i.e. that value contained in the society's annual commodity product which is newly created by the year's labor is equal, just as with any single commodity or the product of a day, week, etc., to the sum of the variable capital advanced, LA, to that value component destined to serve again for the purchase of labor power, plus the surplus value, which the capitalist can realize in items for his individual consumption, in the case of simple reproduction and with other conditions remaining the same, if we bear in mind moreover that Smith lumps together labor in its value creating capacity, as expenditure of labor power, with labor in its capacity of creating use value, labor spent in useful, purposive form. Then the whole conception boils down to this: the value of any commodity is the product of labor. So too, therefore, is the value of the product of a year's labor or the value of the society's annual commodity product. Since however all labor can be resolved into 1. Necessary labor time, in which the worker simply reproduces an equivalent for the capital advanced in purchasing his labor power, and 2. Surplus labor, by which he supplies the capitalist with a value for which the latter pays no equivalent, i.e. a surplus value, all commodity value can then be resolved simply into these two different components, and in the last analysis it forms, as wages, the revenue of the working class, and as surplus value, that of the capitalist class. As far as the constant capital value is concerned, however, i.e. the value of the means of production consumed in the production of the annual product, there is no way of telling how this value comes into the value of the new product, except in the mere phrase that the capitalist charges it to the buyer when he sells his commodity. But ultimately, since the means of production are themselves the product of labor, this portion of value can in turn consist only of an equivalent for the variable capital and the surplus value. That is, it can consist only of the product of necessary labor and surplus labor. If the values of these means of production function in the hands of their employers as capital values, this does not hinder them from being divisible, originally, and if one goes to the root of it, in other people's hands, even though earlier, into the same two portions of value, into two different sources of revenue. A correct point in all this is that in the movement of the social capital, i.e. of the totality of individual capitals, things look different from the way they do when each individual capital is taken separately, i.e. from the standpoint of each individual capitalist. For the latter, commodity value can be resolved into 1. A constant element, a fourth. Former presentations of the subject 461 element, as Smith says, and 2. The sum of wages and surplus value, wages, profit and rent. From the social standpoint, however, Smith's fourth element, the constant capital value, simply vanishes. Summary: the absurd formula that the three revenues of wages, profit and rent form three components of commodity value, derives in Smith's case from the more plausible formula that commodity value resolves itself into these three components. This too is false, even on the assumption that commodity value can be divided simply into the equivalent for the labor power used up in the surplus value created by the latter. This error, however, is based in turn on a deeper and true foundation. Capitalist production rests on the fact that the productive worker sells his own labor power as a commodity to the capitalist, in whose hands it then functions simply as an element of his productive capital. This transaction, the sale and purchase of labor power, does not just introduce the production process, but implicitly determines its specific character. The production of a use value, and even of a commodity, something that can also be undertaken by independent productive workers, is here only a means for the production of absolute and relative surplus value for the capitalist. In analyzing the production process, therefore, we saw how the production of absolute and relative surplus value determines 1. The duration of the daily labor process, and 2. The whole social and technical shape of capitalist production. It is within this process that the distinction emerges between the mere maintenance of value, of the constant capital value, the actual reproduction of value advanced, the equivalent for labor power, and the production of surplus value, a value for which the capitalist neither advanced a previous equivalent, nor advances one after the event. The appropriation of surplus value, of a value over and above the equivalent of the value advanced by the capitalist, even though it is introduced by the purchase and sale of labor power, is an act performed within the production process itself, and forms an essential moment of the latter. The introductory act of circulation, the purchase and sale of labor power, itself depends in turn on a distribution of the social elements of production, which is the presupposition and premise of the distribution of social products, viz. the separation between labor power as a comm. 462 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital commodity for the worker, and the means of production is the property of non-workers. At the same time, however, this appropriation of surplus value, the separation of value production into the reproduction of the value advanced and the production of a new value that does not replace any equivalent, a surplus value, in no way affects the substance of value itself and the nature of value production. The substance of value is and remains nothing more than expended labor power, labor independent of its particular useful character. And value production is nothing but the process of this expenditure. If the feudal serf, for example, expends his labor power for 6 days of the week, i.e. works for these 6 days, it makes no difference to the fact of this expenditure of labor power as such that he may work for 3 of these days on his own field and 3 others on his lord's field and for his lord. Both his voluntary labor for himself and his forced labor for his lord are equally labor, inasmuch as this is considered as labor in relation to the values, or even the useful products, created by it. There is no distinction between these 6 days' labor. The distinction is solely related to the different situations which have given rise to the expenditure of his labor power in the 2 halves of the 6-day working period. It is just the same with the necessary and surplus labor of the wage laborers. The process of production disappears in the finished commodity. The fact that labor power was expended to create it now appears in the form that the commodity has the following concrete property: it possesses value. The magnitude of this value is measured by the amount of labor expended. The commodity value cannot be resolved into anything further, and consists of nothing more. If I draw a straight line of a certain length, I have, in the first place, produced a straight line, only symbolically, of course, as I am aware from the start, by my manner of drawing, practiced in accordance with certain rules, laws, that are independent of me. If I divide this line into 3 segments, which may be required for a certain problem, then each of these 3 pieces remains a straight line, as before, and this division does not resolve the line whose parts they are into anything other than a straight line, e.g. a curve of some kind. Just as little can I divide this line of a given length in such a way that the sum of these parts is greater than the undivided line itself. The length of the undivided line, in other words, is not determined by the lengths of the segments into which it is divided. It is rather the relative lengths of the latter that are limited in advance by the limits of the line of which they are parts. Former presentations of the subject 463 in this respect, the commodity produced by the capitalist is in no way distinguished from a commodity produced by an independent worker, by a community of workers, or by slaves. In our case, however, the entire product of labor and its entire value belongs to the capitalist. Just like any other producer, he has first to transform the commodity into money by selling it. Before he can manipulate it any further, he must convert it into the form of the universal equivalent. Let us consider the commodity product as it is before it is transformed into money. It belongs completely to the capitalist. But while, as the product of useful labor, as a use value, it is in every respect the product of the labor process just completed, the same is not true of its value. A part of this value is merely the value of the means of production used up to produce the commodity, which reappears in a new form. This value has not been produced in the process of producing the commodity, for the means of production already possessed this value before the production process in question and independently of it. They entered this process as the bearers of this value, and all that has been replaced and changed is simply its form of appearance. For the capitalist, this part of the commodity value forms an equivalent for the portion of the constant capital value he advanced that has been consumed in the commodity's production. It previously existed in the form of means of production, it now exists as a value component of the newly produced commodity. Once the latter has been converted into money, this value now existing in money must be transformed back again into means of production, into its original form as determined by the production process and by its own function within this. The value character of a commodity is in no way changed by the function of this value as capital. A second portion of the commodity's value is the value of the labor power that the worker sells to the capitalist. This is determined, just like the value of the means of production, independently of the production process which the labor power is to enter, and is fixed in an act of circulation, the purchase and sale of labor power, before this goes into the production process. In the course of his function, the expenditure of his labor power, the wage laborer produces a commodity value equal to the value that the capitalist has to pay him for the use of his labor power. He gives the capitalist this value in commodities, and the capitalist pays him the same in money. If this part of the commodity value is for the capitalist only an equivalent for the variable capital that he has to advance in wages, this makes absolutely no difference to the fact that it is a commodity value newly created. 464 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital during the production process, consisting exactly like the surplus value at past expenditure of labor power. Just as little is this affected by the fact that the value of labor power, paid by the capitalist to the worker in the form of wages, assumes for the worker the form of a revenue, and that in this way not only is the labor power continuously reproduced, but also the class of wage laborers as such, and with it the basis of capitalist production as a whole. However, there is more to the commodity's value than the sum of these two components. Over and above them both, there is still the surplus value. This has in common with the value component that replaces the variable capital advanced in wages that it is a value newly created by the workers. Congealed labor. It is just that it does not cost anything to the owner of the total product, the capitalist. This circumstance is what enables the capitalist to consume it completely as revenue, as long as he does not have to deduct parts of it for others with a stake in it, e.g. rent for the landlords. In which case these portions then constitute the revenues of third parties of this kind. This same circumstance was also the driving motive for our capitalist to concern himself with commodity production at all. But neither his original benevolent intention to hunt out surplus value, nor the subsequent spending of this as revenue by himself and others, affects the surplus value as such. It in no way alters the fact that it is unpaid congealed labor, nor does it alter its size, which is determined by quite other factors given that Adam Smith already wanted to concern himself in dealing with commodity value with the roles that the various parts of this play in the overall process of reproduction. It should have been evident that, if certain portions function as revenue, others must just as constantly function as capital, and on his logic, this means that these should also have been described as constituent parts of the commodity value, or parts into which it is resolved. Adam Smith identifies commodity production in general with capitalist commodity production. The means of production are capital, from the beginning, labor as wage labor, and hence, the number of useful and productive laborers is everywhere in proportion to the quantity of capital stock which is employed in setting them to work. Introduction, page 105. In short, the various factors of the labor process, objective and personal, appear from the start in the character masks of the era of capitalist production. The analysis of commodity value therefore directly coincides with the question as to how far this value is, on the former presentations of the subject 465 one hand, simply the equivalent for the capital laid out, and how far, on the other hand, it constitutes free value that does not replace any capital value advanced, is surplus value. The portions of commodity value compared from this standpoint are thereby transformed surreptitiously into its independent component parts, and ultimately into the sources of all value. A further conclusion is that commodity value is composed of revenues of various kinds, or alternatively is resolved into these revenues, so that it is not the revenues that consist of commodity value, but rather the commodity value that consists of revenues. But just as it scarcely affects the nature of a commodity value as commodity value, or of money as money, whether it functions as capital value or not, so equally a commodity value is scarcely altered by the fact that it goes on to function as revenue for this person or that. The commodities Smith is dealing with here are commodity capital from the start, and therefore include surplus value as well as the capital value consumed in their production. They are commodities produced in the capitalist manner, the result of the capitalist production process. This last should therefore have been the object of prior analysis, together with the process of valorization and value formation that it involves. And since the very presupposition of this is in turn commodity circulation, its presentation also requires, therefore, an independent and prior analysis of the commodity. Asterisk. Even when Smith in his esoteric aspect occasionally comes up with something correct, he takes account of value formation only in connection with the analysis of commodities, i.e. the analysis of commodity capital. 3. Later writers Ricardo reproduces Adam Smith's theory almost verbatim. It must be understood that all the productions of a country are consumed, but it makes the greatest difference imaginable whether 7. The passage which extends from here to the end of this chapter is an addition from manuscript I. This is of course Marx's own procedure in Capital, volume 1 of which commences with the analysis of commodities and money, part 1, and continues with the all-round analysis of the capitalist production process. The separate text on the results of the immediate process of production, published in the present edition as an appendix to volume 1, analyses commodities produced in the capitalist manner as this result. And this lays the basis for the analysis of capital circulation in volume 2. 466 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital. They are consumed by those who reproduce, or by those who do not reproduce another value. When we say that revenue is saved, and added to capital, what we mean is, that the portion of revenue, so said to be added to capital, is consumed by productive instead of unproductive laborers. Principles, page 169, note, Pelican edition. In point of fact, Ricardo completely accepted Smith's theory of the resolution of commodity price into wages and surplus value, or variable capital and surplus value. What he takes issue with Smith over are 1. The components of surplus value. He eliminates ground rent as a necessary element of it. 2. Ricardo breaks down commodity price into these components. The magnitude of value thus comes first. He takes the sum of the components as a given magnitude, rather than deriving the magnitude of value of the commodity after the event by adding together its components, as Smith often does, even against his own better judgment. Ramsey remarks against Ricardo. He seems always to consider the whole produce as divided between wages and profits, forgetting the part necessary for replacing fixed capital. An essay on the distribution of wealth, Edinburgh, 1836, page 174. What Ramsey understands by fixed capital is what I call constant capital. Fixed capital exists in a form in which, though assisting to raise the future commodity, it does not maintain laborers. Ibid. Page 59. Adam Smith balked at the logical conclusion of his resolution of commodity value, and thus of the value of the annual social product, into wages and surplus value, i.e. simply into revenue, the conclusion that the total annual product could then be entirely consumed. It is never the original thinkers who draw the absurd conclusions. They rather leave this for the Sayes and McCullochs. Say certainly has an easy time of it. What is for one person an advance of capital is for the other revenue and net product, or was so at least. The distinction between gross and net product is purely subjective, and thus the entire value of all products has been distributed in society as revenue. Traité d'économie politique, 1817, 2, page 64. The total value of any product is composed of the profits of the landlords, the capital ISDS and the artisans, thus wages figure here as profits de industrio, artisans' profits, 1, who have contributed to its production. This means that the society's revenue is equal to the gross value produced, and not. Former presentations of the subject 467 is the sect of economists, the physiocrats, believed, only equal to the net product of the soil, page 63, Marx's emphasis. This discovery of Sayes was taken over by Proudhon, among others. Stork also accepts Adam Smith's doctrine in principle, but finds the application made of it by Say to be untenable. If it is held that the revenue of a nation is equal to its gross product, i.e. that no capital, he should say no constant capital, needs to be deducted, it must also be conceded that this nation can consume the entire value of its annual product unproductively, without making the least inroad on its future revenue. The products that compose the constant capital of a nation are not consumable. Stork, consider a Tillon sur la nature du revenu national, Paris, 1842, pp. 147, 150. Stork has forgotten to tell us how the existence of this constant portion of capital fits in with the analysis of prices that he has taken over from Smith, in which commodity value contains only wages and surplus value, but no portion of constant capital. It is only through Say that he realizes that this price analysis leads to absurd results, and his own last word on it is, that it is impossible to resolve the necessary price into its simplest elements. Cours d'économie politique, Petersburg, 1815, 2, page 141. Sismondi, who deals particularly with the relation between capital and revenue, and in actual fact makes his particular conception of this relationship the differentia specifica of his Nouveaux Principes, did not utter a single scientific word or contribute one jot or tittle to the explanation of the problem. Barton, Ramsey and Cherbuliez * make attempts to go beyond Smith's conception. They fail because they pose the problem one-sidedly from the start, by not clearly separating the distinction between constant and variable capital from the distinction between fixed and circulating capital. John Stuart Mill, too, reproduces the doctrine handed down by Adam Smith to his successors, with his customary air of self-importance. The result is that Smith's confusion persists to this day, and his dogma forms an article of orthodox belief in political economy. Antoine-Élise Cherbuliez, a Swiss economist influenced by both his compatriot Sismondi and Ricardo. See Theories of Surplus Value. Part 3, Chapter 23. Chapter 20. Simple Reproduction. I formula Tillon of the problem 1. If we consider the result of the annual functioning of the social capital, that is of the total capital of which the individual capitals are only fractions, their movement being both an individual movement and at the same time an integral link in the movement of the total capital. If we consider therefore the commodity product which the society supplies in the course of the year, we shall necessarily be able to see how the reproduction of the social capital proceeds, what characteristics distinguish this reproduction process from the reproduction process of an individual capital, and what characteristics are common to both. The annual product includes both the parts of the social product that replace capital, social reproduction, and the parts that accrue to the consumption fund and are consumed by workers and capitalists, i.e. both productive and unproductive consumption. This consumption thus includes the reproduction, maintenance of the capitalist class in the working class, and hence too the reproduction of the capitalist character of the entire production process. The form of circulation that we have to analyze is evidently C_MC. C. MC and consumption necessarily plays a role in this, for the starting point C equals C plus C, the commodity capital, includes not only constant and variable capital value, but also surplus value. This movement thus encompasses both individual consumption and productive consumption. In the circuits MC, P. C, M, and P. C, M, C. P. The movement of capital is both the starting point and the concluding point, and this certainly also involves consumption, for the commodity, the product, has to be sold. But once this is assumed to have happened, it is 1. From Manuscript 2. Simple Reproduction 469 immaterial, for the movement of the individual capital, what later becomes of this commodity. with the movement of C. C, on the other hand, the preconditions for social reproduction can be immediately recognized from the fact that it is necessary to demonstrate what becomes of each portion of the value of this overall product C. The overall process of reproduction here includes the consumption process mediated by circulation, just as much as the reproduction of capital itself. For our present purpose, in fact, the process of reproduction has to be considered from the standpoint of the replacement of the individual components of C, both in value and in material. We can no longer content ourselves, as with the value analysis of the product of the individual capital, with the assumption that the individual capitalist first converts the components of his capital into money by selling his commodity product, and can then transform this back into productive capital by repurchasing his elements of production on the commodity market. These elements of production, insofar as they are of the objective kind, form as much a component of the social capital as the individual finished product that is exchanged for them and replaced by them. On the other hand, the movement of the part of the social commodity product that is consumed by the worker in spending his wage, and by the capitalist in spending surplus value, not only forms an integral link in the movement of the total product, but is also interwoven with the movements of the individual capitals, so that its course, too, cannot be explained by being simply presupposed. The immediate form in which the problem presents itself is this. How is the capital consumed in production replaced in its value out of the annual product, and how is the movement of this replacement intertwined with the consumption of surplus value by the capitalists and of wages by the workers? What we are dealing with first of all is reproduction on a simple scale. Moreover, we assume not only that products are exchanged at their values, but also that no revolution in values takes place in the components of the productive capital. Inasmuch as prices diverge from values, this circumstance cannot exert any influence on the movement of the social capital. The same mass of products is exchanged afterwards as before, even though the value relationships in which the individual capitalists are involved are no longer proportionate to their respective advances and to the quantities of surplus value produced by each of them. As far as revolutions in value are concerned, they change nothing in the relations between the value components of 470, the reproduction and circulation of the total social capital, the total annual product, as long as they are generally and evenly distributed. Insofar as they are only partially and unevenly distributed, they represent disturbances which, firstly, can be understood only if they are treated as divergences from value relations that remain unchanged. Secondly, however, given proof of the law that one part of the value of the annual product replaces constant capital, and another variable capital, then a revolution, either in the value of the constant capital or in that of the variable, would in no way affect this law. It would alter only the relative magnitudes of the portions of value that function in one or the other capacity, because different values would have appeared in place of the original values. As long as we were dealing with capital's value production and the value of its product individually, the natural form of the commodity product was a matter of complete indifference for the analysis, whether it was machines or corn or mirrors. This was always simply an example, and any branch of production whatever could equally serve as illustration. What we were dealing with then was the actual immediate process of production, which presented itself at each turn as the process of an individual capital. Insofar as the reproduction of capital came into consideration, it was sufficient to assume that the opportunity arose within the circulation sphere for the part of the product that represented capital value to be transformed back into its elements of production, and therefore into its shape as productive capital, just as we could assume that worker and capitalist found on the market the commodities on which they spent their wages and surplus value. But this purely formal manner of presentation is no longer sufficient once we consider the total social capital and the value of its product. The transformation of one portion of the product's value back into capital, the entry of another part into the individual consumption of the capitalist and working classes, forms a movement within the value of the product in which the total capital has resulted, and this movement is not only a replacement of values, but a replacement of materials, and is therefore conditioned not just by the mutual relations of the value components of the social product but equally by their use values, their material shape. 2. Simple reproduction on the same scale seems to be an abstraction, both in the sense that the absence of any accumulation or reproduction on an expanded scale is an assumption foreign to the capitalist basis, and in the sense that the conditions in which production takes place do too. From manuscript VIII. Simple reproduction 471 not remain absolutely the same in different years, which is what is assumed here. The supposition is that a social capital of a given value supplies the same mass of commodity values and satisfies the same quantity of needs in both the current year and the previous year, even if the forms of the commodities may change in the reproduction process. But since, when accumulation takes place, simple reproduction still remains a part of this, and is a real factor in accumulation, this can also be considered by itself. Moreover, the value of the annual product may decrease, even though the volume of use values remains the same. The value may remain the same, even though the volume of use values declines. The value and volume of the use values reproduced may decrease simultaneously. What emerges from all this is that reproduction either takes place under more favorable circumstances than previously, or under more difficult ones, and the latter may result in an incomplete, defective reproduction. All this can affect only the quantitative aspect of the various elements of reproduction, and not the role that they play in the total process as capital reproducing itself or as reproduced revenue. 2. The two departments of social production. 3. The society's total product, and thus its total production process, breaks down into two great departments. Means of production. Commodities that possess a form in which they either have to enter productive consumption, or at least can enter this. 1. Means of consumption. Commodities that possess a form in which they enter the individual consumption of the capitalist and working classes. In each of these departments, all the various branches of production belonging to it form a single great branch of production, one of these being that of means of production, the other that of means of consumption. The total capital applied in each of these two R. S of production forms a separate major department of the social capital. In each department, the capital has two components. 1. Variable capital. As far as its value goes, this is equal to the value of the social labor power applied in this branch of production, i.e. the 3. Mainly from manuscript II, the schema from manuscript VIII. 472 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital sum of the wages paid for it. Considered in its material aspect, it consists of self-acting labor power itself, LA. Of living labor set in motion by this capital value. 2. Constant capital. This is the value of all the means of production applied to production in this branch. It breaks down in turn into fixed capital, machines, instruments of labor, buildings, draft animals, etc., and circulating constant capital, materials of production, such as raw and ancillary materials, semi-finished goods, etc. The value of the total annual product created in each of these two departments with the aid of this capital breaks down into a component that represents the constant capital C consumed in its production, only its value being transferred to the product, and the portion of value that is added by the overall annual labor. This last breaks down again into the replacement of the variable capital versus advanced in the excess over it that forms the surplus value S. Just as with the value of any individual commodity, so that of the total annual product of each department also breaks down into C plus V plus S. The value component C, which represents the constant capital consumed in the course of production, is not the same thing as the value of the constant capital applied in production. The materials of production are certainly completely consumed, and their value is therefore entirely transferred to the product. But only a part of the fixed capital is entirely consumed, its value thereby being transferred to the product. Another part of the fixed capital in machines, buildings, etc. continues to exist and to function just as before, even if its value is diminished by the annual wear and tear. This part of the fixed capital that continues to function does not exist for us when we consider the value of the product. It forms a part of the capital value that is independent of this newly produced commodity value and is present alongside it. This was already shown when we considered the value of the product of an individual capital, Volume 1, Chapter 8, pp. 311-12. Here, however, we must set aside for the time being the mode of consideration used there. We saw in dealing with the product of an individual capital how the value subtracted from the fixed capital by wear and tear is transferred to the commodity product created during the period of this depreciation, irrespective of whether or not a part of this fixed capital is replaced in kind during this period out of this transferred value. Here, however, in dealing with the total social product and its value, it is necessary to abstract at least provisionally from the portion of value transferred to the annual product during the year by the wear and tear. Simple reproduction 473 of the fixed capital, inasmuch as this fixed capital is not replaced again in kind in the course of the year. In a later section of this chapter, section 9, we shall discuss this point separately. Asterisk. For our investigation of simple reproduction, we intend to use the following schema, in which C equals constant capital, V equals variable capital, S equals surplus value, and the rate of valorization is taken as 100%. Versus the figures may be in millions of marks, francs or pounds sterling. I production of means of production. Capital 4, U-C plus 1000 V equals 5000. Commodity product 4000 C plus 1, U plus 1000 equals 6000, existing in the form of means of production. 2. Production of means of consumption. Capital 2000 C plus 500 V equals 2500. Commodity product 2000 C plus 500 V plus 500 equals 3000, existing in means of consumption. The total annual commodity product, taken together, is thus, I 4000 C plus 1, U plus 1000 equals 6000 means of production. 2. 2000 C plus 500 V plus 500 S equals 3000 means of consumption. The total value is 9000, the fixed capital that continues to function in its natural form being excluded by our assumption. If we now investigate the transactions necessary on the basis of simple reproduction, where the whole surplus value is unproductively consumed, and ignore in the first instance the monetary circulation that mediates these, we gain from the outset three important clues towards further developments. 1. The 500 V of workers' wages in Department 2 and the 500 S surplus value of the capitalists in the same department must be spent on means of consumption. But their value exists in the means of consumption to a value of 1000 that restore to the capitalists of Department 2 the 500 V. They advanced, and represent besides this their 500 S. The wages and surplus value in Department 2 are thus converted within Department 2 into the product of Department 2. 500 V plus 500s, 2 equals 1000 in means of consumption thereby drops out of the total product. 2. The 1, UV plus 1000s in Department I must likewise be spent on means of consumption, i.e. on the products of Department 2. It must therefore be exchanged for the remaining part of this product, representing constant capital, to the equal amount of 2 UC. Department 2 474 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital receives for this an equal sum in means of production, the product of Department I, which embodies the value of 1000 V plus 1000s in Department I in this way, 2000 ILC and L, UV plus 1000s, I drop out of the account. 3. There still remains 4000 IC. This consists of means of production that can only be used in Department I and serve to replace the constant capital consumed there. They are therefore disposed of by mutual exchange among the individual capitalists of Department I, just as the 500 V plus 500s, 2 was disposed of by exchange between workers in capital ISDS, or between individual capitalists, in Department 2. This is simply temporary, for the better understanding of what follows. 3. Exchange between the two departments, I, V plus S, AG AINSTIIC 4. We begin with the major exchange between the two departments, 1000 V plus 1000s, L. Values that exist in the hands of their producers in the natural form of means of production, are exchanged for 2000 ILC, values that exist in the natural form of means of consumption. The capitalist class in Department 2 thereby converts its constant capital of 2000 from the form of means of consumption back into that of means of production for these means of consumption, into a form in which it can function afresh as a factor of the labor process and as a constant capital value for the process of valorization. On the other hand, the equivalent for labor power in Department I, 1000 IV, and for the surplus value of the capitalists in this department, 1000 is thereby realized in means of consumption. Both of these are converted from their natural form of means of production into a natural form in which they can be consumed as revenue. This mutual exchange is brought about by a money circulation, which both mediates it and makes it harder to comprehend, even though it is of decisive importance, since the component of variable capital must always reappear in the money form, as money capital which is converted from the money form into labor power. Variable capital must be advanced in the money form in all the branches of production simultaneously pursued alongside one another across the entire surface of the society, irrespective of whether these belong to departments I or 2. 4. From here on, again manuscript VIII. Simple reproduction 475 The capitalist buys labor power before it enters the production process, but pays for it only at a prearranged date, after it has already been spent in the production of use values. Just like the remaining portion of the product's value, so the part of this that is simply an equivalent for the money spent in payment for labor power, the value portion of the product that represents the variable capital value, also belongs to the capitalist. In this particular portion of value, the worker has supplied the capitalist with the equivalent for his wage. However, it is the transformation of the commodity back into money, its sale, that again restores to the capitalist his variable capital as money capital, which he can advance once more in order to purchase labor power. In Department I, the collective capitalist has already paid the workers £1,000, L. 1000 versus, I say, pound, simply to denote that this is value in the money form, for the versus component of the value of a product of Department I, L. of the value of the means of production produced by those workers. The workers use this £1,000 to purchase means of consumption of the same value from the capitalists in Department 2, and thereby transform half of Department II's constant capital into money. The capitalists in Department II, for their part, use this £1,000 to buy means of production to the value of 1,000 from the capitalists in Department I. As a result of this, the variable capital value equals 1,000 versus, which existed as a part of Department I's product in the natural form of means of product tion, is transformed back again into money, and can now function once more in the hands of the Department I capitalists as money capital to be converted into labor power, L. into the most essential element of productive capital. In this way, through the realization of one part of their commodity capital, their variable capital flows back to them in the money form. As far as money is concerned, i.e. the money needed to exchange the S component of Department I's commodity capital for the second half of Department II's constant capital component, it may be advanced in various ways. In actual fact, this circulation comprises countless individual purchases and sales by individual capitalists in the two departments, and the money for this must in all circumstances originate from these capitalists, since we have already accounted for the money cast into circulation by the workers. At one time, a capitalist in category I may use the money capital that he has alongside his productive capital to purchase means of production from the capitalists of category I, while on another occasion a capitalist from category I may buy means of consumption from the capitalists of category 2 476 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital with the part of his money fund that is earmarked for personal expenses, rather than for capital expenditure. As we have already shown in parts 1 and 2, certain reserves of money, whether for capital advance or for expenditure of revenue, must always be taken as present in the hands of the capitalists alongside their productive capital. Let us assume that half the money is advanced by the capitalists in Department II on the purchase of means of production to replace their constant capital, the other half spent by the capitalists in Department I on consumption. The proportions are quite immaterial for our present purpose. Then Department II advances £500 and uses this to purchase means of production from Department I, so that, including the above £1,000 coming from Department I's workers, it has replaced 3/4 of its constant capital in kind. Department I uses the £500 received in this way to buy means of consumption from Department II, so that half of that part of its commodity capital that consists of S has gone through the circulation 1 CMC and this, its product, has been realized in a consumption fund. By this second process, the £500 returns to the hands of the Department II capitalists as money capital which Department II possesses alongside its productive capital. On the other hand, Department I anticipates the sale of half the part of its commodity capital that is still in store as a product, with a money expenditure to the sum of £500 for the purchase of means of consumption from Department II. The same £500 enables Department II to buy further means of production from Department I and thereby replace its entire constant capital, 1,000 plus 500 equals 2,000, in kind, while Department I has realized its entire surplus value in means of consumption. All in all, an exchange of commodities amounting to £4,000 has taken place with a monetary circulation of £2,000, this latter sum only being as high as it is because the entire annual product is depicted as having been exchanged all at once in a few large amounts. J. That is important here is the fact that Department I does not only convert the constant capital, reproduced by it in the form of means of consumption, back into the form of means of production, but, on top of this, the £500 that it advances to the circulation sphere to acquire means of production returns to it. In the same way, Department I not only recovers possession of its variable capital, which it reproduced in the form of means of production, in the money form, as money capital which is directly convertible back into labor power, but besides this, the £500 that it spent before the sale of the surplus value part of its capital, on one, greater than purchasing means of consumption in anticipation, also flows back to simple reproduction 477 it. However, it does not flow back through this actual expenditure, but rather through the subsequent sale of the part of its commodity product that bears half its surplus value. In these two cases, not only is the constant capital of Department II converted from the product form back into the natural form of n means of production, in which alone it can function as capital, and similarly not only is the variable component of capital in Department I converted into the money form and the surplus value part of the means of production in Department I converted into a form consumable as revenue. Besides all this, the £500 of money capital that Department II advanced on the purchase of means of production, before it had sold the compensating part of the value of its constant capital, present in the form of means of consumption, flows back to it, and there flows back to Department I the £500 that it had spent in anticipation on the purchase of means of consumption. If the money that Department I advanced on the account of the constant part of its commodity product, and Department I on the account of a part of the surplus value in its commodity product, flows back to them, this is simply because the one class of capitalists casts into circulation, besides its constant capital existing in the commodity form of Department II, £500 in money, and the other class £500 over and above its surplus value existing in the commodity form of Department I. Ultimately, the two departments pay one another fully by the exchange of their respective commodity equivalents. The money that they cast into circulation over and above the total value of their commodities, as a means for exchanging these commodities, returns to each of them from the circulation sphere to the exact amount that each of the two cast into it. Neither has become a farthing richer from all this. Department II had a constant capital of 2,000 in the form of means of consumption, and 500 in money. It now has 2,000 in the form of means of production, and 500 in money as before. Semi-yearly Department I has, as before, a surplus value of 1,000, now transformed from its own commodities, means of production, into a consumption fund, and 500 in money. The general conclusion that follows, as far as concerns the money that the industrial capitalists cast into circulation to mediate their own commodity circulation, is that whether this is advanced on the account of the constant value portion of their commodities, or on the account of the surplus value existing in these commodities insofar as it is spent as revenue, the same amount flows back to the respective capitalists as they themselves advanced for the monetary circulation. 478 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital as far as the retransformation of Department I's variable capital into the money form is concerned. This exists for the capitalists in Department I, after they have laid it out on wages, firstly in the commodity form in which their workers have supplied it to them. They have paid it out to the workers in the money form as the price of their labor power. They have in this way paid out the value component of their commodity product that is equal to the variable capital laid out in money. This is why they are also the owners of this part of the commodity product. But the section of the working class that they employ is not the buyer of the means of production they have themselves product. The variable capital advanced in money for the payment of labor power thus does not directly return to the capitalists of Department I. It is transferred by the purchases of the workers into the hands of the capitalist producers of the commodities needed by and generally accessible to the working class milieu, i.e. into the hands of the capital ISDS of Department II, and it is only by this detour, by being first employed by these for the purchase of means of production, that it returns to the hands of the Department I capitalists. The result of all this is that, in the case of simple reproduction, the value components V plus S of the commodity capital in Department I, and therefore a corresponding proportionate part of Department I's total commodity product, must be equal to the constant capita. IIC similarly precipitated out by Department II is a proportionate part of its total commodity product. In other words, I, V plus S, equals IIC4. Exchange within Department II. Necessary means of subsistence and luxury items of the value of the commodity product in Department II, we still have to investigate the components versus plus S. This does not bear on the most important question we are dealing with here: the extent to which the breakdown of the value of each individual capitalist commodity product into CTV plus S holds also for the value of the total annual product, even if mediated by a different form of appearance. That question is resolved by the exchange of I, V plus S, against IIC on the one hand, and by the reproduction of IC in the annual commodity product of Department I on the other, something that will be left for later investigation. See section 6 below. Since 2, V plus S, exists in the natural form of items of consumption, since the variable capital advanced to the workers in pay. Simple reproduction 479 meant for labor power must be spent by them by and large on means of consumption, and since, on the supposition of simple reproduction, the S component of commodity values is also spent as revenue on means of consumption, it is evident at first glance that the workers in Department 2 use the wages received from the Department 2 capitalists to buy back a part of their own product, a part corresponding in extent to the money value they receive as wages. In this way, the capitalist class of Department 2 retransform the money capital they have advanced in payment for labor power into the money form. It is just as if they had paid the workers in mere tokens of value. As soon as the workers realize such tokens by purchasing a part of the commodity product produced by them and belonging to the capitalists, these value tokens return to the hands of the capitalists. In our case, however, the tokens not only represent value, but actually possess value in their material existence as gold or silver. We shall later investigate more closely this particular kind of reflux of the variable capital advanced in the money form, which takes place through the process in which the working class appears as buyer and the capitalist class as seller. See section 5 below. What matters here is a different point which must be dealt with in discussing this reflux of the variable capital back to its starting point. Department 2 of the annual commodity production consists of the most diverse branches of industry, but as far as its products go, these may be broken down into two major subdivisions. A. Those means of consumption that enter the consumption of the working class, and, insofar as they are necessary means of subsistence, also form part of the consumption of the capitalist class, even if this part is different in both quality and value from that of the workers. This whole subdivision can be classified for our present purpose under the heading necessary means of consumption, and in this connection it is quite immaterial whether a product such as tobacco, for example, is from the physiological point of view a necessary means of consumption or not. It suffices that it is such a means of consumption by custom. B. Luxury means of consumption, which enter the consumption only of the capitalist class, i.e. can be exchanged only for the expenditure of surplus value, which does not accrue to the workers. As far as the first category goes, it is evident that the variable capital advanced in the production of the kinds of commodities pertaining to it has to flow directly back in the money form to the section of capital ISDS in Department 2, i.e. the capitalists in IA, who produce these necessary means of subsistence. They sell these to their own workers to 480 the reproduction and circulation of the total social capital, the amount of the variable capital paid the latter in wages. This reflux is a direct one for subdivision A of the capitalist class in Department II as a whole, no matter how numerous may be the transactions between the capitalists in the various component branches of industry by which this reflux of variable capital is proportionately distributed. These are processes of circulation in which the means of circulation are directly supplied by the money spent by the workers. It is different, however, with subdivision lib. The component of the value product with which we are dealing here, ILB, V plus S, exists entirely in the natural form of luxury items, LA. Items that the working class can as little buy as they can buy the commodity value IV existing in the form of means of production, even though these luxury items are, like the means of production, products of the workers' concern. The reflux by which the variable capital advanced in this subdivision returns to the capitalist producers in its money form cannot be a direct one, therefore, but has to be mediated in a similar way to the case of IV. Let us assume, as above, that for Department 2 as a whole, V equals 500, S equals 500, but that the variable capital and the surplus value corresponding to it is distributed as follows. Subdivision A. Necessary means of subsistence, V equals 400, S equals 400, i.e. a quantity of commodities in the form of necessary means of consumption to the value of 400 V plus 400. S equals 800, or ILA, 400 V plus 400. S. Subdivision B. Luxury items to the value of 100 V plus 100. S equals 200, are lib, LUV plus 100. S. The workers in lib have received 100 in money in payment for their labor power, let us say £100 sterling. They use this to buy means of consumption to the sum of 100 from the capitalists in ILA. This class of capitalists then buys 100 worth of commodities lib, and in this way the variable capital of the capitalists in lib flows back to them. The capitalists in ILA already have their 400 V back in the money form, as a result of exchange with their own workers, of the part of their product that represents surplus value. Moreover, a quarter has been passed to the workers in lib, and, in exchange for this, lib, 100 V, in luxury goods have been withdrawn. If we now suppose that the capitalists in IA and lib divide their expenditure of revenue in the same proportions between necessary means of subsistence and luxury items, i.e. if we assume that both of them spend of their revenue on necessary means of subsistence and I on luxuries, then this means that the capitalists in subdivision E spent I of their surplus value revenue of 400 S on their own products. Simple reproduction 481 necessary means of subsistence, i.e. 240, and T equals 160 on luxury articles. The capitalists of subdivision Lib divide their surplus value equals 100 S. In a similar way, equals 60 on necessities and T equals 40 on luxuries, these latter being produced and exchanged within their own subdivision. We shall now see how the 160 of luxury items received for ILA S flows to the capitalists in ILA. Out of 1 IA, 400 S. In the form of necessary means of subsistence, we already saw how 100 was exchanged for an equal sum of IIB, V existing in luxury articles. A further 60 has then to be exchanged for ILB, 60 S. In luxuries, the whole account at the start is ILA, 400V plus 400 S. Lib. LOO. V plus 100 S. Single quote. 1. 400 V. A. As consumed by the workers in ILA, whose product, necessary means of subsistence, it forms part of. The workers buy this from the capitalist producers in their own subdivision. In this way £400 in money flows back to these capitalists, the variable capital value of 400 that they paid to their own workers. This can now be used to buy labor power again. 2. A part of the 400 IA, equal to the 100 V. B. L. 1/4 of the surplus value, A, is realized in luxury items in the following way. The workers in B receive £100 as wages from the capitalists in their own subdivision. They use this to buy 1/4 of IA, i.e. commodities that exist in the form of necessary means of subsistence. The capitalists of 0 use this money to buy luxury articles to the same amount, 100 V. B. L. Half of the total luxury production. In this way, the variable capital of the capitalists, B, flows back to them in the money form, and they are able to begin their reproduction afresh by renewing the purchase of labor power, since the total constant capital of the entire Department 2 has already been converted by the exchange of I, V plus S, for ILC. Thus the luxury workers can sell their labor power once again only because the part of their own product that they created is, and since the whole versus plus S of subdivision Lib is consumed by the capitalists, and the workers of the two subdivisions together consume the equivalent of IA. V plus IIB. V in the FON of necessities, the product of subdivision IA, the consumption fund for the capitalists of the two subdivisions, ILA plus Lib, as composed of ILA, necessities, ILA, V4, LLAV plus LLB. V, workers' consumption, equals ILA, LLB. U, Lib, luxuries, IIB, V plus, which in this case comes to 300 IA plus 200 ILB. The ratio in which the Department II capitalists as a whole divide their revenue expenditure between necessities and luxuries is thus already determined, once the relative production of the two subdivisions and the rates of surplus value obtained in them are given. The only additional supposition that Marx makes here, therefore, is that the two subdivisions taken separately each divide their expenditure according to this already given overall average. 482 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital equivalent for their wages has been drawn by the capitalists IA into their consumption fund, turned into cash. The same applies to the sale of labor power in Department I, since the lie against which I, V plus S, as exchanged consists of both luxury goods and necessary means of subsistence, while what is renewed by I, V plus S, are the means of production both for luxury goods and for necessary means of subsistence. 3. We come now to that exchange between A and B, which is simply an exchange between the capitalists of the two subdivisions. We have already disposed of the variable capital 400 V, and a part of the surplus value 100 5 in A, as while as of the variable capital LUV in B. We further assumed that the capitalists in both cases divide their expenditure of revenue in the average ratio of for luxuries and I for necessary provisions. Besides the 100 paid out for luxuries, which has already been spent, subdivision A, as a whole still has a further 60 for luxuries to come and, in the same ratio, B, has a total of 40. IA. S is therefore divided into 240 for means of subsistence and 160 for luxuries. 240 plus 160 equals 400. S, 1 IA. IIB, S is divided into 60 for means of subsistence and 40 for luxuries. 60 plus 40 equals 100 S, Lib. The latter 40 is consumed by this class out of their own product, of their surplus value. The 60 for means of subsistence they receive by exchanging 60 of their own surplus product for 60 SCA. We have therefore the following equations for the capitalist class of Department 2, seen as a whole, where V plus S exists for subdivision A, in necessary means of subsistence, for B, in luxury articles, ILA, 400 V plus 400s, plus LLB, 100. V plus 100. 5, equals 1. 000. Through the above described movement, 500. V, A plus B, is realized in 400. V, A, and 100 A, and 500 A plus B, is realized in 3 U's, A, plus 100 V, B, plus 100s, B, a total of 1000. For A and B, each considered by itself, we obtain the realizations, V. SO 400, 0. Plus 24O. OLU, BH 60. S, B, 800. B, V plus 10 degrees SCA. S equals 206 degrees SCA, plus 4 degrees SCB, 1000 if we stick for simplicity's sake to the same ratio between variable and constant capital in the two subdivisions, although this is in no way necessary, then we obtain for 400. V. A constant capital of 1600, and for Louvre, B, a constant capital of 400. The subdivisions of Department 2 are then as follows. Simple reproduction 483, Lia, 1, 6 U. E plus 400. V plus 400. S. Equals 2400, lib, 400. E plus 100. V plus 100. Equals 600 altogether, 2000 E plus 500. V plus 500. S. Equals 3000. Out of the 2000 Li in means of consumption that are exchanged for 2000 I, V plus S. We accordingly have 1600 exchanged for means of production of necessary means of subsistence, and 400 for means of production of luxuries. The 2000 I, V plus S, is thus itself broken down into 800. V plus 800s, 14, A, or 1600 in means of production for necessary means of subsistence, and 200. V plus 2 Us, 14, B, are 400 in means of production for luxuries. An important part, not only of the means of labor proper, but also of the raw and ancillary materials, etc., is the same for both subdivisions. But as far as the exchanges of the various value components of the total product I, V plus S, are concerned, any division along these lines would be completely irrelevant. Both the above 800 IV and the 200 IV are realized through the spending of wages on means of consumption 1000 Li, so that the money capital advanced for wages is distributed evenly on the reflux between the capitalist producers of Department I, and proportionately converts the variable capital they advance back again into money. On the other hand, as far as the realization of the 1000 is concerned, here too the capitalists uniformly draw 600 ILA and 400 lib in means of consumption from the entire second half of Li equals 1000, in proportion to the size of their S. i.e. those who replace the constant capital of 2 a draw, 480, I, from 600. E, LLA, and 320, from 400. E, lib, equals 800. Those who replace the constant capital of lib draw, 120, I, from 600 E, 1 EA, and 80, from 400. E, lib, equals 200, a total of 1000. What is arbitrarily chosen here, for both departments I and II, is the ratio of variable capital to constant capital. Arbitrary also is the identity of this ratio between the departments and their subdivisions. This identity is assumed here only for the sake of simplification, and the assumption of different ratios would not change anything at all in the conditions of the problem or its solution. The necessary result, however, on the assumption of simple reproduction, is as follows. 1. The new value product of the year's labor that is created in the natural form of means of production, which can be broken down into versus plus S, is equal to the constant capital value C in the product of the other section of the year's labor, reproduced in the form of means of consumption. If it were smaller than Li, then Department 2 could not 484 the reproduction and circulation of the total social capital completely replace its constant capital. If it were larger, then an unused surplus would be left over. In both cases, the assumption of simple reproduction would be destroyed. 2. In the annual product reproduced in the form of means of consumption, the variable capital versus advanced in the money form can be realized only by those of its recipients who are workers in the luxury trades in the part of the necessary means of subsistence that at first sight embodies surplus value for its capitalist producers, i.e. the versus that is laid out on luxury production is equal to a part of S corresponding to it in value which is produced in the form of necessary means of subsistence, and must thus be smaller than the total S, 1 EA S, that is. Dash. And it is only by realizing this V in part of S that the variable capital advanced by the capitalist producers of luxury articles returns to them in the money form. This is a phenomenon quite analogous to the realization OFL, V plus S, in ILC, only that in the second case, IIB, V is realized in a part of ILA, S equal to it in value. These ratios remain qualitatively decisive in every distribution of the annual social product, inasmuch as this actually goes into the process of annual reproduction mediated by circulation. I, V plus S, can be realized only in ILC, just as ILC can be renewed only in its function as a component of the productive capital by way of this realization. 1 IB, V, similarly, can be realized only in a part of 1 EA, S, and only in this way can 1 IB, V be transformed back into its form as money capital. It goes without saying that this applies only to the extent that all this is really a result of the reproduction process itself, LA. Inasmuch as the capitalists in lib do not for instance obtain their verses on credit from another source. Quantitatively, however, the exchange between the various parts of the annual product only takes place in the proportionate way depicted above to the extent that the scale of production and the value ratios involved in it remain constant, and these fixed ratios are not altered by foreign trade. If it is now said, in the manner of Adam Smith, that I, V plus S, is resolved into ILC, and ILC resolved into I, V plus S, or alternatively, as he often and still more absurdly likes to say, I, V plus S, form components of the price, or as he says, value in exchange, of ILC, and ILC forms the entire component of the value I, V plus S, then one could say, and one would in fact have to say as well, that 1 IB versus can be resolved into IA S, or ILA S into lib V, or that 1 IB versus forms a component of the surplus value of ILA, and vice versa. In this way, the surplus value would be resolved into wages or variable capital, and this variable capital would form a component of the surplus value. This piece of absurdity is actually to be found in Smith, inasmuch as he sees wages as determined by the simple reproduction 485 value of the necessary means of subsistence, and these commodity values is determined in turn by the value of the wages, variable capital, and surplus value contained in them. He is so absorbed in the fractions into which the value product of a working day breaks down on the capitalist basis, Le into versus plus S, that he completely forgets that it is quite immaterial, in simple commodity exchange, whether the equivalents that exist in various natural forms consist of paid or unpaid labor, since in both cases they need the same amount of labor for their production, and that it is equally immaterial whether A's commodity is a means of production and B's a means of consumption, whether after its sale the one commodity has to function as a component of capital, and the other to go into the consumption fund and be, according to Adam, consumed as revenue. The use that the individual buyer makes of his commodity does not fall into the sphere of commodity exchange, of circulation, and does not affect the value of the commodity. This is in no way altered by the fact that analysis of the circulation of the total annual social product must deal with the specific destination in tet, mis of use, the consumption aspect, of the different components of that product. In connection with the exchange, noted above, of IIB V for an equal valued portion of IA S, and the further exchanges between LIA S and LIB S, it is in no way assumed, whether we are dealing with the capitalists of IA and LIB individually or in the aggregate, that they divide their surplus value between necessary consumption and luxuries in the same ratio. One person may spend more on one kind of consumption, another person on something else. All that is presupposed on the basis of simple reproduction is that a sum of value equal to the total surplus value is realized in a consumption fund. The limits of this are thus given. Within each department, one person may spend more on A, another person more on B, though these may compensate for one another in such a way that the capitalist class in both A and B, taken as a whole, share in each in the same proportion. The value relations, however, the proportionate shares in the total value of the products of Department 2 for the two kinds of producers, A and B, and therefore also a definite quantitative ratio between the branches of production that supply those products, are necessarily given in each concrete case. It is only the ratio taken by way of example that is hypothetical. If a different one is taken, then this in no way alters the qualitative aspects. It is only the quantitative determinations that change. If any circumstances lead to a change in the proportionate magnitudes of A and B, then the conditions of simple reproduction alter accordingly. 486 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital. Since 1 IB V is realized in an equivalent portion of 1 IA S, it follows that as the luxury part of the annual product grows, and a rising quota of labor power is absorbed in luxury production, the retransformation of the variable capital advanced in 1 IB V into money capital that can function anew as the money form of variable capital, and with it the existence and reproduction of the part of the working class engaged in lib. Their supply of necessary means of consumption, as conditioned by the prodigality of the capitalist class, the conversion of a significant part of their surplus value into luxury items. Every crisis temporarily decreases luxury consumption. It delays and slows down the retransformation of IIB V into money capital, so that only a partial transformation is possible and a section of the luxury workers are thrown onto the streets. This leads in turn to a stagnation and restriction in the sale of necessary means of consumption. And this quite apart from the unproductive workers who are discharged at the same time, workers who receive for their services a part of the luxury expenditure of the capitalists. They are themselves to this extent a luxury item, and who also participate very substantially in the consumption of necessary means of subsistence, etc. The reverse is the case in periods of prosperity, and particularly during the phase of hyperactivity, when the relative value of money, as expressed in commodities, already falls for other reasons, without a real revolution in values taking place, and so the prices of commodities rise independently of their own value. It is then not only the consumption of necessary means of subsistence that rises. The working class, in which the entire reserve army of labor has now been enrolled, also takes a temporary share in the consumption of luxury articles that are otherwise for the most part necessary only for the capitalists. This phenomenon also provokes a rise in prices. It is a pure tautology to say that crises are provoked by a lack of effective demand or effective consumption. The capitalist system does not recognize any forms of consumer other than those who can pay, if we exclude the consumption of paupers and swindlers. The fact that commodities are unsaleable means no more than that no effective buyers have been found for them. No consumers, no matter whether the commodities are ultimately sold to meet the needs of productive or individual consumption. If the attempt is made to give this tautology the semblance of greater profundity, by the statement that the working class receives too small a portion of its own product, and that the evil would be remedied if it received a bigger share, i.e. if its wages rose, we need only note that crises are always preparate by a period in which simple reproduction 487 wages generally rise, and the working class actually does receive a greater share in the part of the annual product destined for consumption. From the standpoint of these advocates of sound and simple common sense, such periods should rather avert the crisis. It thus appears that capitalist production involves certain conditions independent of people's good or bad intentions, which permit the relative prosperity of the working class only temporarily, and moreover always as a harbinger of crisis. 5. We saw just now how the proportional relation between the production of necessary items of consumption and the production of luxuries gives rise to the division of 2, V plus S, into ILA and LIB. And so also of IIC into IA, C and 1IB, C. It thereby affects the character and the quantitative ratios of production right at the roots, and is an essential determining factor of their overall pattern. Simple reproduction is oriented by nature to consumption as its aim. Even though the squeezing out of surplus value appears as the driving motive of the individual capitalist, this surplus value, no matter what its proportionate size, can be used here, in the last analysis, only for his individual consumption. Insofar as simple reproduction is also part of any annual reproduction on an expanded scale, and the major part at that, this motive remains alongside the motive of enrichment as such and in opposition to it. In the real world the matter appears more intricate, since the partners who share the loot, the surplus value of the capitalist, figure independently of him as consumers. 5. The mediation of the exchanges by Monnet ARY circulation as we have analyzed it up to the present, circulation takes place between the different categories of producer according to the following schema. 1. Between departments I and 2, I 4000 C plus 1000 V plus 1000 2. 2000 C plus 500 V plus 500 S. This disposes of the circulation of Li equals 2000, which is exchanged for 1000 V plus 1000 5. This should be noted by prospective supporters of Rodbertus's theory of crises. Fe. 488 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital. There remains the circulation of V plus S within Department 2, we leave aside for the time being the 4000 IE. This 2, V plus S, as divided between the subdivisions ILA and LIB as FO IIOWs, 2. 500 V plus 500 S equals A, 400 V plus 400s, plus B, 100 V plus 100 S, the 400 V, A, circulates within its own subdivision. The workers paid with it use it to buy necessary means of subsistence that they have themselves produced from their employers, the capitalists in ILA. Since the capitalists of both subdivisions spend their surplus value L on products of ILA, necessary means of subsistence, and on products of LIB, luxuries, T of the surplus value of A, i.e. 240, is consumed within subdivision ILA itself. Similarly I of the surplus value in B, which was produced and is present in luxuries, is consumed within subdivision LIB. There still remains to be exchanged between ILA and LIB. On the part of 2A, 160 S. Single quote. On the part of LIB, 100 V plus 60s. These cancel each other out. With the 100 they receive in money as wages, the workers in LIB buy necessary means of subsistence from IA. The capitalists in IA thereby receive the money they require in order to invest T of their surplus value, equals 160 S. In the luxuries produced by LIB, 100 V. That remains in the hands of the capitalists of LIB as the product replacing the wages they paid, and 60s. The schema for this is thus, 3. ILA, 400 V, plus 240 S, plus 160 5. B, 100 V plus 60 S, plus 40 S, where the items in parentheses are those that circulate and are consumed only within their own subdivision. The direct reflux of the money capital advanced in variable capital, which takes place for the capitalists only in subdivision IA producing necessary means of subsistence, is simply a manifestation, modified by special conditions, of the general law already explained that the money that commodity producers advance returns to them in the normal course of commodity circulation. What also follows from this, incidenta aelie, is that wherever there is a money capitalist behind the commodity producers, and it is he who first advances the money capital to the industrial capitalist, money capital in the strict sense of the word, i.e. capital value in the money form, the actual point of return of this money is the pocket of the money capitalist. In this way, even if the money circulates through the hands of more or less all concerned, the mass of the circulating money belongs to the Department of Money Capital organized and concentrated in the form of banks, etc. The way simple reproduction 489 in which this department advances its capital determines that the final reflux in the money form I always to it, even if this is mediated by the transformation of the industrial capital back into money capital. Two things are always required for commodity circulation. Commodities have to be cast into circulation, and so has money. The process of circulation, therefore, unlike the direct exchange of products, does not disappear from view once the use values have changed places and changed hands. The money does not vanish when it finally drops out of the series of metamorphoses undergone by a commodity. It always leaves behind a precipitate at a point in the arena of circulation vacated by the commodities. Volume 1, Chapter 3, page .208. In the circulation between Li and I, V plus S, for example, we assumed that £500 was advanced for this circulation by Department 2. In the countless circulation processes which the circulation between major social groups of producers is resolved into, it is now one of this group and now one of that who first appears as a buyer and casts money into circulation. Quite apart from individual circumstances, this is already determined by the difference in the production periods and hence the turnovers of the various commodity capitals. Department II uses £500 to buy means of production to this amount from Department I, but the latter uses the £500 to buy means of consumption from II. The money simply flows back to Department II, which is not made any the richer by this reflux. Department I first cast £500 into circulation in money and withdrew commodities to the same value. It then sold commodities for £500 and extracted from circulation the same amount in money. In this way, the £500 flows back. In point of fact, Department 2 has cast into circulation £500 in money and £500 in commodities, a total of £1,000. It withdraws from circulation £500 of commodities and £500 in money. The circulation sphere needs only £500 in money for the conversion of both £500 in commodities, I, and £500 in commodities, 2. So whoever advanced the money for the purchase of someone else's commodity receives it back again in the sale of his own. If it had been Department I that first bought commodities worth £500 from Department 2 and later sold £500 of commodities to Department 2, this £500 would return to Department I instead of to Department II in Department I. The money invested in wages, advanced as variable capital in the money form, does not return directly in this form, but indirectly by a detour. In Department 2, on the other hand, the £500 for wages returns directly from the workers to the capitalists, since this reflux is always direct where sale and purchase are repeated 490 the reproduction and circulation of the total social capital between the same persons in such a way that they regularly face J&E another alternately as buyer and seller of commodities. The capitalist in Department 2 pays for his labor power in money. He thereby incorporates the labor power into his own capital, and it is only by this process of circulation, which for him is simply the transformation of money capital into productive capital, that he, as industrial capitalist, confronts the worker as his wage laborer. But after this the worker, who was in the first instance the seller, the dealer in his own labor power, now, in the second instance, confronts the capitalist, the seller of commodities, as the possessor of money. In this way the money laid out by the capitalist on wages flows back to him. In so far as the sale of these commodities does not involve swindling, etc., but equivalents are exchanged in commodities and money, this is not a process by which the capitalist can enrich himself. Nor does he pay the worker twice over, first in money and then in commodities. His money returns to him when the worker exchanges it with him for commodities. This money capital transformed into variable capital, the money advanced as wages, plays a major role in actual monetary circulation. Since the working class has to live from hand to mouth, since it cannot give the industrial capitalists any long-term credit, variable capital has to be advanced at the same time in money at countless different points in society, and at definite and short intervals, such as a week, etc. These periods are repeated fairly rapidly, no matter how different the turnover periods of capitals in the various branches of industry. Though the shorter the intervals, the smaller need be the relative size of the total sum of money cast into circulation at one stroke through these channels. In every country of capitalist production, the money capital advanced in this way forms a relatively decisive share in the total circulation, and all the more so in that the same money flows through the most varied channels and functions as means of circulation for a myriad other businesses, before returning to its starting point. Asterisk. Let us now consider the circulation between I, V plus S, and Li from a different point of view. The capitalists in Department I advance £1,000 as payment for wages. The workers use this to buy £1,000 worth of means of subsistence from. This does of course apply when Department I is taken as a whole, in contrast to Department I, but as Marx has just explained, within Department I it properly applies only to subdivision I, producing means of subsistence that enter the consumption of the working class. Simple reproduction 491 the capitalists in Department II, and these in turn use it to buy means of production from the capitalists in Department I. The variable capital advanced by the latter has now returned to them in its monetary form, while the capitalists in Department I have transformed half of their constant capital from the form of commodity capital back into productive capital. The capitalists in Department 2 advance a further £500 in money to get means of production from Department I. The capital ISDS in Department I spend this money on means of consumption from Department 2. This £500 thus flows back to the capitalists in Department I, who advance it afresh in order to transform the last quarter of the constant capital they previously transformed into commodities back into its productive natural form. This money again flows back to Department I and once more withdraws from Department 2 means of consumption to the same amount. The capitalists in Department 2 are now as before in possession of £500 in money and £2,000 in constant capital, though this has been newly converted from the form of commodity capital back into that of productive capital. With £1,500 in money, a commodity mass of £5,000 has been circulated. To recapitulate. 1. Department I pays its workers £1,000 for labor power of the same value. 2. These workers use this £1,000 to buy means of subsistence from Department 2. 3. Department 2 buys means of production with the same money from Department I, thereby restoring Department I's variable capital in its money form. 4. Department 2 uses £500 to buy means of production from Department I. 5. Department I buys means of consumption from Department I with the same £500. 6. Department 2 buys means of production from Department I with this £500. 7. Department I buys means of consumption from Department II with the £500. As a result, the £500 which Department 2 cast into circulation on top of its £2,000 in commodities, and for which it did not withdraw any equivalent in commodities, has flowed back to it. 6. The presentation here departs somewhat from that given previously, page 476. Their Department I also cast its own £500 into circulation. Department II alone supplies the additional money material needed for circulation. This, however, in no way alters the principle involved. F.E. 492 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital. The exchange process thus takes the following course. 1. Department I pays £1,000 for labor power, i.e. for a commodity of £1,000. 2. Its workers use their wages to buy means of consumption from Department 2 to the amount of £1,000, commodities of £1,000. 3. With the £1,000 received from these workers, Department 2 buys means of production to the same value from Department I, i.e. commodities of £1,000. With this, £1,000 in money, as the money form of the variable capital, has flowed back to Department I. 4. Department 2 buys means of production from Department I for £500, commodities of £500. 5. Department I uses the same £500 to buy means of consumption from Department 2, i.e. commodities of £500. 6. Department II uses the £500 to buy means of production from Department I, commodities of £500. 7. Department I uses the £500 to buy means of consumption from Department 2, commodities of £500. The sum of the commodity values exchanged is £5,000. The £500 that Department 2 advanced for its purchases has returned to it. As a result, 1. Department I possesses variable capital in the money form to the sum of £1,000, which is what it originally advanced to the circulation sphere. It has also spent £1,000 on individual consumption, from its own commodity product. It has spent the money that it received for the sale of means of production, amounting to the total of £1,000. On the other hand, the natural form into which the variable capital existing in the money form has to be converted, i.e. labor power, has to be maintained, reproduced by consumption, and be present once again is the only article of trade of its proprietors, who have to sell this if they want to live. In this way, the relationship between wage laborers and capitalists is also reproduced. 2. The constant capital of Department 2 is replaced in kind, and the £500 advanced to circulation by Department 2 has returned to it. For the workers in Department I, the circulation is the simple one of CMC. C. 1. Labor power. M. 2. £1,000, the money form of the variable capital in Department I. C. 3. Necessary means of subsistence to the sum of £1,000. This £1,000 converts into money the same value of constant capital in Department 2, existing in the commodity form as means of subsistence. Simple reproduction 493 For the capitalists in Department 2, the process is CM, the transformation of a part of their commodity product into the money form, from which it is transformed back into components of their productive capital, i.e. into a part of the means of production that they need. In the advance of M, £500, which the capitalists in Department 2 make in order to purchase the remaining components of their means of production, they anticipate the money form of that part of I, i.e. that is still in the commodity form, means of consumption. In the Act MC, in which Department 2 buys with M and Department I sells C, Department II's money is transformed into a part of its productive capital, while I's commodity undergoes the Act CM and is transformed into money, although it does not represent any component of capital value, but rather realized surplus value which is simply spent on means of consumption. In the circulation MCP. CM. The first Act MC of one capitalist is the final Act CM of another, or part of it. It is completely immaterial for the commodity circulation itself whether this C, by which M is transformed into productive capital, represents for its seller, who thereby converts this C into money, the constant component of his capital, the variable component, or surplus value. As far as the Department I capitalists are concerned, with respect to the component versus plus S of their commodity product, they withdraw more money from the circulation sphere than they cast into it. Firstly, their £1,000 of variable capital returns to them. Secondly, they sell means of production for £500, see above, exchange number 4, and this enables them to convert half their surplus value into cash. Then they again sell a further £500 of means of production, exchange number 6, the second half of their surplus value, and as a result their entire surplus value has been withdrawn from circulation in the money form. We have therefore, in succession, 1. Variable capital transformed back into money, £1,000. 2. Half of the surplus value realized, £500. The other half of the surplus value, £500. A total realized of 1000 V plus 1000 equals £2,000. Even if Department I cast only £1,000 into circulation, we leave aside here the circumstances that mediate the reproduction of IC, which will be considered later, it has withdrawn twice the amount. Of course, the S that has been realized, transformed into money, immediately vanishes again into someone else's hands, Department II, because the money is exchanged for means of consumption. The capitalists of Department I have withdrawn only as much in money as they cast in commodities. The fact that this value is surplus value, and costs the capitalists no 494 the reproduction and circulation of the total social capital in no way alters the value of the commodities themselves. It is therefore completely immaterial, as far as the exchange of values in commodity circulation is concerned. The realization of the surplus value in money is naturally temporary, just like all other forms that the capital advanced passes through in its conversions. It lasts only so long as the interval between the transformation of Department I's commodities into money and the subsequent transformation of I's money into IR's commodities. If the turnovers are assumed to be shorter, or, from the standpoint of simple commodity circulation, the velocity of monetary circulation is assumed to be greater, then still less money would be needed in order to circulate the commodity values to be exchanged. This sum is always determined, once the number of successive exchanges is given, by the sum of the prices or values of the circulating commodities. The proportion in which this sum of values consists of surplus value on the one hand and capital value on the other is completely irrelevant here. Say that in our example wages are paid 4 times a year in Department I4. X 250 equals 1,000, and so £250 in money would be sufficient for the circulation of IVTILC, and for the circulation between the variable capital IV and the labor power of Department I in the same way. If the circulation between IS and IIC consisted of 4 turnovers, then £250 would be sufficient for it, and therefore a total sum of money or a money capital of £500 would be enough for the circulation of commodities to the sum of £5,000. A quarter of the surplus value would then be realized 4 times a year, instead of half of it twice. If in exchange number 4, it was Department I instead of Department II that appeared as the buyer, £500 in money was spent on means of consumption to the same value, Department I would then buy means of production with the same £500 in exchange number 5. In exchange number 6, Department I would use this £500 to buy means of consumption, and in number 7, Department II would use it again to buy means of production. Thus the £500 would ultimately return to Department I, instead of Department II as before. The surplus value is realized here by the money spent by its capitalist producers themselves on their private consumption, which represents anticipated revenue, anticipated income from the surplus value contained in the commodities still to be sold. The realization of surplus value does not take place through the reflux of the £500, for alongside the £1,000 in commodities IV, Department I has cast £500 of money into circulation in connection with exchange number 4, and this was an additional sum, not, as far as we know, the proceeds. Simple reproduction 495 of the sale of the commodities. When this money flows back to Department I has simply recovered its additional money, and not realized its surplus value. The monetary realization of Department I's surplus value simply involves the sale of the Col 1 LL1 oddities in which it is contained, and each time it lasts only as long as the money released by the sale of these commodities is net spent again on means of consumption.
Department I uses its additional money, £500, to buy means of consumption from Department II. This money is spent by Department I, which gets the equivalent for it in commodities from Department II. The money flows back the first time through the purchase by Department II of £500 of commodities from Department I. It flows back therefore as the equivalent for the commodities sold by Department I, but these commodities cost Department I nothing, they are part of its surplus value, so that it is the money that Department I itself cast into circulation that realizes its own surplus value.
Similarly, on its second purchase, No. 6, Department I again receives its equivalent in commodities from Department II. Suppose that Department II does not buy means of production from Department I, No. 7. Then Department I would in fact have paid £1,000 for means of consumption, and consumed its entire surplus value as revenue, i.e. paid £500 in its own commodities, means of production, and £500 in money. It would still have £500 of its own commodities, means of production, in stock on the other hand, but would have got rid of its £500 of money. Department II, on the contrary, would have transformed 3/4 of its constant capital from the form of commodity capital back into productive capital, but it would have 1/4 left in the form of money capital, £500. This being in fact idle money or money whose functioning has been interrupted and which is held in abeyance. If this situation lasts too long, then Department II will have to reduce the scale of its reproduction by 1/4. However, the £500 in means of production which Department I is still saddled with is not surplus value in the commodity form. It is there in place of the £500 advanced in money, which Department I possessed alongside its surplus value of £1,000 in the commodity form. As money, this exists in an ever realizable form. In the commodity form, it is temporarily unsaleable. This much is evident, that simple reproduction in which each element of productive capital in both Department I and Department I has to be replaced. Remains possible only if the 500 golden birds return to Department I, which first sent them flying. 496 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital. Once a capitalist spends his money on means of consumption, he is then done with it, it has gone the way of all flesh. Here we are still concerned only with industrial capitalists, who stand as the representatives for all others. If the money flows back to him again, this can happen only insofar as he fishes it out of the circulation sphere in exchange for commodities. By way of his commodity capital. Just as the value of his total annual commodity product, his commodity capital, can be broken down into constant capital value, variable capital value and surplus value, so too can every element of this, i.e. the value of every individual commodity. The realization of each of his individual commodities, the elements of his commodity product, is therefore at the same time the realization of a certain quota of the surplus value contained in the total commodity product. It is therefore literally correct, in the present case, that the capitalist himself cast into circulation the money into which he converts his surplus value, i.e. by means of which he realizes it, and, what is more, by spending this on means of consumption. What we have here of course are not the identical pieces of money, but rather a given quantity of hard cash equal to the money cast into circulation to cover his personal needs, or to the part of the money needed for that purpose. In practice this occurs in two ways. If the business was started only within the current year, then it takes a good while, at best a few months, before the capitalist can spend money for his personal consumption out of his income from this actual business. He does not on this account suspend his consumption for a moment. He advances himself money against the surplus value that he still has to hunt out, whether this is advanced from his own pocket or from someone else's by way of credit. But this money is also a circulating medium in which he can later realize his surplus value. In the other case, where the business has already been in regular operation for some time, payments and receipts take place at different times of the year, but the capitalist's consumption, which anticipates his receipts and the level of which is fixed as a certain proportion of his customary receipts or those estimated, still continues without interruption. With each portion of commodities sold, one part of the surplus value to be made in the year is realized. But if, out of the commodities produced in the year, no more is sold than is needed to replace the constant and variable capital value contained in them, or if prices fall so that the sale of the entire annual product realizes only the capital value advanced in it, then the anticipatory character of the money spent against future surplus value clearly. Simple reproduction 497 emerges. If our capitalist goes bankrupt, then his creditors in the courts investigate whether his anticipated private spending stood in due proportion to the state of his business and the customary or normal receipts of surplus value corresponding to it. In relation to the capitalist class as a whole, however, the proposition that it must itself cast into circulation the money needed to realize its surplus value, and also to circulate its capital, constant and variable, is not only far from paradoxical, it is in fact a necessary condition of the overall mechanism. For here there are just two classes, the working class, which only disposes of its labor power, and the capitalist class, which has the monopoly of the means of social production and of money. It would rather be a paradox if, instead, it was the working class that initially advanced the money required to realize the surplus value contained in commodities, out of its own resources. The individual capitalist, however, effects this advance only by acting as buyer, spending money on the purchase of means of consumption or advancing money on the purchase of elements of his productive capital, either labor power or means of production. He only ever parts with the money in exchange for an equivalent. He advances money to circulation only in the same way that he advances commodities to it. In both cases, he acts as the starting point of their circulation. The real course of events is obscured by two circumstances. 1. The appearance of commercial capital, the primary form of which is always money, since the merchant as such does not produce any product or commodity, and of money capital, as the object of manipulation of a special kind of capitalist, in the circulation process of industrial capital. 2. The division of surplus value, which must always exist in in the hands of the industrial capitalist, into different categories, the bearers of which appear alongside the industrial capitalist is the landlord, for ground rent, the moneylender, for interest, etc., as well as the government and its officials, rentiers, etc. These fellows face the industrial capitalist as buyers, and to this extent realize his commodities in money. They too cast their share of money into the circulation sphere, and he receives this from them. What is always forgotten in connection with this are the sources from which they originally obtained this money, and continue to obtain it. 498 The reproduction and circulation of the total social capital 6. The constant capital in Department 17 It still remains for us to investigate the constant capital in Department I, 4000 c. This is equal in value to the means of production consumed in the production of this mass of commodities, a value which reappears in the commodity product of Department I. This reappearing value, which was not produced in the production process of Department I, but entered it the year before as constant value, as the given value of its means of production, now exists in that entire part of the commodity mass of Department I that is not absorbed by Department II. Moreover, the value of this commodity mass remaining in the hands of the Department I capitalists is 2/3 of the value of their entire annual commodity product. If we were dealing with the individual capitalist producing one particular means of production, we could say, he first sold his commodity product, transformed it into money. By transforming it into money, he also transformed the constant value component of his product back into money. With this value portion transformed into money, he then bought his means of production again from other commodity sellers, or transformed the constant value component of his product into a natural form in which it could once more function as productive constant capital. Now, however, this assumption becomes untenable. The capitalist class in Department I comprises the totality of capitalists who produce means of production. Moreover, the commodity product of 4,000 that remains in their hands is a part of the social product that cannot be exchanged against any other, for there is no such other part of the annual product. With the exception of this 4,000, all the remainder has been disposed of. One part of it has been absorbed by the social consumption fund, and another part has to replace the constant capital of Department II, which has already exchanged everything it has available for exchange with Department I. The difficulty is very simply resolved when we remember that the entire commodity product of Department I consists in its natural form of means of production, of the material elements of constant capital itself. The same phenomenon is displayed here as previously with Department II, only under a different aspect. In Department II, the entire commodity product consists of means of consumption. One part of these, measured by the wages plus surplus value contained in this commodity product, can therefore be consumed by its own producers. Here in Department I, the entire commodity product consists of means 7. From here on, manuscript II. Simple reproduction 499 of production, buildings, machinery, containers, raw and ancillary materials, etc. One part of these, that which replaces the constant capital used up in this sphere, can therefore immediately function in its natural form once again as a component of the productive capital. In so far as it steps into the circulation sphere, it circulates within Department I. In Department II, one part of the commodity product is individually consumed in kind by its own producers. In Department I, on the other hand, a part of the product is productively consumed in kind by its own capitalist producers. In the 4,000 part of the commodity product of Department I, there reappears the constant capital value consumed in this department, and it reappears moreover in a natural form in which it can immediately function again as productive constant capital. In Department II, the part of the commodity product of 3,000 whose value equals wages plus surplus value, equals 1,000, goes directly into the individual consumption of the capitalists and workers, while the constant capital value of this commodity product, on the other hand, equals 2,000, cannot go back into the productive consumption of the capitalists in Department II, but has to be replaced by exchange with Department I. In Department I, on the contrary, the part of its commodity product of 6,000 whose value is equal to wages plus surplus value, equals 2,000, does not go into the individual consumption of its producers, and it is also unable to do this owing to its natural form. Instead, it must first be exchanged with Department II. However, the constant portion of this product's value, equals 4,000, does exist in a natural form in which, taking the capitalist class of Department I as a whole, it can directly function again as their constant capital. In other words, the entire product of Department I consists of use values which by virtue of their natural form can serve only as elements of constant capital, given the capitalist mode of production. Out of this product, which has a value of 6,000, 1/3, 2,000, therefore replaces the constant capital of Department II, and the remaining 2/3 replace the constant capital of Department I. The constant capital of Department I consists of a number of different groups of capitals, invested in the various branches of production of means of production, so much in ironworks, so much in coal mines, etc. Each of these capital groups, or, in other words, each of these social group capitals, is again composed of a larger or smaller number of independently functioning individual capitals. Firstly, the capital of the society, e.g. 7,500. This may stand for millions, etc., as broken down into 500 the reproduction and circulation of the total social capital different capital groups. The social capital of 7,500 is broken down into particular portions, each invested in a particular branch of production. The part of the social capital value invested in each particular branch of production consists, in its natural form, partly of the means of production for each special sphere of production, partly of the labor power necessary and appropriately qualified for the industry in question, modified in various ways by the division of labor, according to the specific kind of labor that it has to perform in the sphere of production in question. The part of the social capital applied in each particular branch of production consists once again of the sum of individual capitals invested and independently functioning in it. This obviously applies to both departments, I and II. As far as concerns the constant capital value reappearing in Department I in the form of its commodity product, part of this goes back once again as means of production into the particular branch of production, or even the individual business, from which it emerged as a product, e.g. corn into the production of corn, coal into coal production, iron in the form of machines into iron production, etc. But to the extent that the partial products of which the constant capital value in Department I consists do not go directly back into their particular or individual spheres of production, they simply change their place. They go in their natural form into another sphere of production of Department I, while the product of these other spheres of production of Department I replaces them in kind. These products merely experience a change of position. They all go back in again as factors that replace the constant capital in Department I, only instead of entering one group of Department I they go into another. Inasmuch as there is exchange here between the individual capitalists of Department I, This is exchange of one natural form of constant capital against another natural form of constant capital, one kind of means of production against other kinds of means of production. It is mutual exchange between the different individual constant portions of capital in Department I. These products, inasmuch as they do not directly serve as means of production in their own branch of production, are thus displaced from their own point of production to another one, and mutually replace each other in this way. In other words, as happens similarly for surplus value in Department I, each capitalist in Department I withdraws the appropriate means of production needed by him from this commodity mass in the proportion to which he is a joint owner of this constant capital of 4,000. If production were social instead of capitalist, it is. Simple reproduction 501 evident that these products of Department I would be no less constantly redistributed among the branches of production in this department as means of production, according to the needs of reproduction, one part directly remaining in the sphere of production from which it emerged as a product, another part being shifted to other points of production, and so there would be a constant to and fro between the various points of production in this department. 7. Variable capital and surplus value in the two departments. The total value of the means of consumption annually produced is equal to the variable capital value reproduced in the course of the year plus the surplus value newly produced, in Department 2, LA. The value actually produced during the year in Department 2, together with the variable capital value reproduced in the year and the surplus value newly produced in Department I, LA. The value produced during the year in Department I, on the premise of simple reproduction, therefore, the total value of the means of consumption annually produced is equal to the annual value product, LA, equal to the total value produced by the labor of the society in the course of the year, and the reason why this must be the case is that with simple reproduction this entire value is consumed. The total social working day breaks down into two parts. 1. Necessary labor. This creates a value of 1,500 versus. In the course of the year. 2. Surplus labor. This creates an additional value or surplus value of 1,500 s. The sum of these values is 3,000, equal to that of the means of consumption annually produced. The total value of the means of consumption produced during the year is therefore equal to the total value that the entire social working day produces during the year, i.e. equal to the value of the social variable capital plus the social surplus value, or equal to the total new annual product. We know, however, that even if these two value magnitudes are equal, this in no way means that the total value of the commodities in Department 2, the means of consumption, has been produced in this department of social production. They are equal because the constant capital value that reappears in Department 2 is equal to the value newly product in Department I, variable capital value plus surplus value, hence I, V plus S, can purchase the part of the product that represents constant 502 the reproduction and circulation of the total social capital value for its producers in Department 2. This explains why even though, for the capitalists in Department 2, the value of their product breaks down into C plus V plus S, yet, considered from the social point of view, the value of this product can be broken down into versus plus S. This is the case, in fact, only because Li is equal here to I, V plus S, and these two components of the social product exchange their natural forms with one another by way of their commodity exchange. After this conversion, therefore, Li exists once again in means of production, and ITV plus S, in means of consumption. It is this circumstance that led Adam Smith to maintain that the value of the annual product resolves itself into versus plus S. This, 1, applies only to the part of the annual product consisting of means of consumption, and 2, does not apply in the sense that this total value is produced in Department 2 and the value of the product is therefore the variable capital value advanced in Department 2 plus the surplus value produced in this department. It holds rather in the sense that 2, E plus V plus S, equals 2, V plus S, plus I, V plus S. Or because Li equals I, V plus S. It also follows that even if the social working day, i.e. the labor spent by the entire working class over a whole year, just like each individual working day, can be simply broken down into two parts, LA, into necessary labor plus surplus labor, and even though the value produced by this working day can therefore be similarly broken down into two parts, LA, the portion of value with which the worker buys his own means of reproduction, and the surplus value that the capitalist can spend for his individual consumption. Yet, from the social standpoint, one part of the social working day is spent exclusively on the production of fresh constant capital, i.e. of products that are exclusively destined to function in the labor process as means of production, and therefore as constant capital in the accompanying process of valorization. On our assumption, the total social working day is represented by a money value of 3,000, of which 1/3 equals 1,000, as produced in Department 2, which produces means of consumption, i.e. the commodities in which the entire variable capital value and the entire surplus value of the society is ultimately realized. On this supposition, therefore, 2/3 of the social working day is applied in the production of new constant capital. Even if, from the standpoint of the individual capitalists and workers in Department I, this 2/3 of the social working day serves merely to produce variable capital value and surplus value. Just like the other third of the social working day in Simple Reproduction 503 Department 2, considered from the social standpoint, and also from the standpoint of the use value of the product, this 2/3 of the social working day still produces only a replacement for the constant capital consumed in the process of productive consumption, or in the process of being consumed. Even taken by itself, this 2/3 of the working day, although the total value it produces for its producers is equal simply to variable capital value plus surplus value, does not produce any use value of such a kind that either wages or surplus value could be spent on it, its product as a means of production. The first thing to note is that no part of the social working day, whether in Department I or Department II, serves to produce the value of the constant capital applied and functioning in these two great spheres of production. All that is produced here is additional value, 2000 I, V plus S, plus 1002, V plus S, in addition to the constant capital value of 4000 I. C plus 2000 I IC. The new value that has been produced in the form of means of production is not yet constant capital. It is simply destined to function as such in the future. The entire product of Department II, means of consumption, is from the use value standpoint, i.e. concretely, considered in its natural form, the product of concrete forms of labor such as weaving, baking, etc. which have been employed in this department. It is the product of this labor inasmuch as the labor functions as the subjective element of the labor process. As far as the constant value component of this product of Department II is concerned, however, it simply reappears in a new use value, in a new natural form, the form of means of consumption, whereas it earlier existed in the form of means of production. Its value has been transferred by the labor process from its old natural form to its new one. But the value of this 2/3 of the value of the product, 2000, has not been produced by Department II in the current year's valorization process. Just as, considered from the standpoint of the labor process, the product of Department II is the result of newly functioning living labor in its given presupposed means of production, labor realizing itself in these as its objective conditions, so from the standpoint of the valorization process the value of the product, 3000, is composed of the new value produced by the 1/3 of the social working day newly added, 500 plus 500 equals 1000, and a constant value in which there is V. S. Objectified 2/3 of a past working day, which took place before the production process of Department II at present under consideration. This value component of the product of Department II can be repra 500 for the reproduction and circulation of the total social capital scented by a portion of the product itself. It exists in a quantity of means of consumption to the value of 2000 equals 2/3 of a social working day. This is the new use form in which it reappears. The exchange of one part of the means of consumption, equals 2000 ILC, for means of production from Department I, equals 1000 V plus 1000s, is therefore in point of fact the exchange of 2/3 of a total working day which does not form part of this year's labor, but was performed prior to the current year, for 2/3 of the social working day newly added in the present year. 2/3 of this year's social working day could not both be applied in the production of constant capital and yet at the same time form variable capital value and surplus value for its own producers, if it were not EXCHNGED with a value component of the means of consumption annually consumed that contains 2/3 of a working day performed and realized prior to the present year. This is an exchange of 2/3 of this year's working day for 2/3 of a working day spent prior to this year, an exchange between labor time of this year and labor time of a previous year. It therefore explains the riddle as to how the value product of the entire social working day can be resolved into variable capital value plus surplus value, even though 2/3 of this working day was not spent on the production of objects in which variable capital or surplus value could be realized, but rather on the production of means of production to replace the capital used up during the current year. This is explained by the simple fact that, considered from the point of view of its value, the 2TL, IRDS of Department II's product in which the capitalists and workers of Department I realize the variable capital value plus the surplus value produced by them, making 2/9 of the total value of the annual product, is the product of 2/3 of a social working day spent before the current year. The total social product of Departments I and II, means of production and means of consumption, is certainly, looked at from the point of view of its use value, its concrete, natural form, the product of this year's labor, but only in so far as this labor is considered simply as useful, concrete labor, not in so as it is viewed as the expenditure of labor power, as value-forming labor. And it is only useful, concrete labor in the sense that the means of production have been transformed into new products, the products of the current year, by the living labor added to them and operating on them. The labor of this year, however, could not have been transformed into products without means of production, i.e. means of labor and production materials, independent of it. Simple reproduction 505.8. The constant capital in both departments as far as concerns the value of the total product, 9,000, and the categories into which it breaks down, its analysis does not offer any greater difficulty than that of the value of the product of an individual capital. It is in fact identical with this. The annual social product, taken as a whole, contains 3 one-year social working days. The value expression of each of these working days is 3,000, so that the value